Christmas time, that man must be a misanthrope indeed, in whose breast something like a jovial feeling is not roused, in whose mind some pleasant associations are not awakened by the recurrence of Christmas. There are people who will tell you that Christmas is not to them what it used to be, that each succeeding Christmas has found some cherished hope or happy prospect of the year before dimmed or passed away, that the present only serves to remind them of reduced circumstances and straitened incomes, of the feasts they once bestowed on hollow friends, and of the cold looks that meet them now in adversity and tune. Never heed such dismal reminiscences. There are few men who have lived long enough in the world who cannot call up such thoughts on any day of the week. Then do not select the merriest of the 365 days for your doleful recollections, but draw your chair near the blazing fire, fill the glass and send round the song. And if your room be smaller than it was a dozen years ago, or if your glass be filled with reeking punch instead of sparkling wine, put a good face on the matter and empty it offhand and fill another, and troll off the odd ditty you used to sing, and thank God it's no worse. Look on the merry faces of your children, if you have any, as they sit round the fire. One little seat may be empty. One slight form that gladdened the father's heart and roused the mother's pride to look upon may not be there. Dwell not upon the past. Think not that one short year ago the fair child now resolving into dust sat before you with the bloom of health upon his cheek and the gaiety of infancy in his joyous eye. Reflect upon your present blessings, of which every man has many, not on your past misfortunes, of which all men have some. Fill your glass again with a merry face and contented heart, our life on it, that your Christmas shall be merry and your New Year a happy one. I was a very young fellow when I wrote that, under a fanciful nom de plume, Tibbs, but I stand by it, both as to writing and as to sentiment. Christmas has always stirred in me the deepest feelings. My father's great instinct and talent for celebration made of our Christmases in Portsmouth and later in Chatham occasions of fabled delight. Decorations, sparkling tree dances, games into which we all of us, from the tiniest of children to the most ancient of elders, hurled ourselves in the festivities. But when we came to London, myself but a sensitive, precocious, over-dramatic child of 11, what a falling off was there. No, forgive me. I realize you haven't the remotest idea who I might be, though you may have read the odd thing I've written. Charles Dickens at your service, otherwise known as Dick, or the Sparkler, or the Inimitable. If you feel disposed as we go along to give expression to any emotion, whether grave or gay, you will do so with perfect freedom from restraint and without the apprehension of disturbing me. We're just a small group of friends assembled to hear a tale told, to celebrate that time of year when man, demonstrating the very best in human nature, comes closest to God. As my younger self said, who can be insensible to the outpourings of good feeling and the honest interchange of affectionate attachment which abound at this season of the year? A Christmas family party. We know nothing in nature more delightful. There seems a magic in the very name of Christmas. Petty jealousies and discords are forgotten. Social feelings are awakened in bosoms to which they have long been strangers. Father and son, or brother and sister who have met and passed with averted gaze or a look of cold recognition for months before, proffer and return the cordial embrace and bury their past animosities in their present happiness. Kindly hearts that have yearned towards each other and have been withheld by false notions of pride and self-dignity, are again reunited. And all is kindness and benevolence. Would that Christmas lasted the whole year through, as it ought, and that the prejudices and passions which deform our better nature were never called into action among those to whom they should ever be strangers.
Remember, oh, the man, oh, the man, oh, the man. Remember, oh, the man, my time is spent. Remember, oh, the man, how thou art dead and gone, and I did what I can, therefore repent. Remember Adam's fall, oh, the man, oh, the man. Remember Adam's fall from heaven to hell. Remember Adam's fall, how we were condemned, oh, in hell perpetual, therefore to dwell. Remember God's goodness, oh, the man, oh, the man. Remember God's goodness and his promise made. Remember God's goodness, how he sent his Son, doubtless, our sins for to redress. Be not afraid. The angels all did sing, oh, the man, oh, the man. The angels all did sing upon the shepherd's hill. The angels all did sing praises to our heavenly King, and peace to man living with our good will. The shepherds amazed it was, oh, the man, oh, the man. The shepherds amazed it was to hear the angels sing. The shepherds amazed it was how it should come to pass that Christ our Messias should be our King. To Bethlehem did they go, oh, the man, oh, the man. To Bethlehem did they go, the shepherds three. To Bethlehem did they go to see whether it was so or no, whether Christ were born or no, to set him free. As the angels before did say, oh, the man, oh, the man. As the angels before did say, so it came to pass. As the angels before did say, they found a babe whereas it lay, in a manger wrapped in hay, so poor he was. In Bethlehem he was born, oh, the man, oh, the man. In Bethlehem he was born for mankind's sake. In Bethlehem he was born for us that were forlorn, and therefore took no soul our flesh to take. Give thanks to God, away, oh, the man, oh, the man. Give thanks to God, away with utmost joyfully. Give thanks to God, away for this our happy day. Let all men sing and say, holy, holy.
Give thanks to God always with hearts most jolly. Exactly. I do heartily detest mournful chanting in churches. In fact, I'm a little divided over the question of churches altogether, but not this one. I'm especially fond of this one, St. Luke's. It was here in 1836 when I was but a lad of 24, and the sketches I wrote in the person of Boz and the first episodes of the posthumous papers of the Pickwick club had erupted onto an unsuspecting world, that I got married. Didn't work out awfully well in the end, that marriage, alas, but at the time, I was bursting for it. I really believe that if I'd not married there and then, I should have spontaneously combusted. We didn't make a big thing of it, my family and Kate's family, a couple of close fellows. We sped away as soon as humanly and decently possible, hot-blooded creatures that we were. But had we been less passionate, we might, with profit, have lingered. The church was and is charming. At the epoch, the biggest and tallest parish church in London, with a nave that was then higher than that of any other London church but St. Paul's. Charming, beautiful, simple, the best kind of church. No Romish decoration and pomp. But not gloomy, no, not at all. Light and open and spacious. What I cannot tolerate is the sort of religious fanatic, my sister Fanny, alas, became just such a one, who sees Sunday as a day of somber reflection and self-control. Let those who have 6 days in the week for all the world's pleasures, I said in a pamphlet written when I was not yet 23, appropriate the seventh to fasting and to gloom, either for their own sins or for those of other people if they like to bewail them. But let those who employ their 6 days in a worthier manner devote their seventh to a different purpose. Let divines set the example of true morality and take for their motto the words that fell from the lips of that master whose precepts they misconstrue and whose lessons they pervert. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Well. But I think you people in the 21st century have righted that wrong. Maybe even, dare one murmur, it strolled a little too far into the other direction. But never mind right and wrong. Now we are in the season of forgiveness. Christmas has come round. This is Tibbs writing again. And the unkind feelings that have struggled against better dispositions during the year have melted away before its genial influence like half-formed ice beneath the morning sun. Uncle George tells stories and carves poultry and takes wine and jokes with the children at the side table and winks at the cousins that are making love or being made love to and exhilarates everybody with his good humor and hospitality. And when, at last, a stout servant staggers in with a gigantic pudding with a sprig of holly in the top, there's such a laughing and shouting and clapping of little chubby hands and kicking up of little fat dumpy legs. This can only be equalled by the applause with which the astonishing feat of pouring lighted brandy into mince pies is received by the younger visitors. Then the dessert and the wine and the fun. Such beautiful speeches and such songs from Aunt Margaret's husband, who turns out to be such a nice man and so attentive to Grandma. Even Grandpapa not only sings his annual song with unprecedented vigour, but on being honoured with an unanimous encore, according to annual custom, actually comes out with a new one, which nobody but Grandmama ever heard of before. And a young scapegrace of a cousin who's been in some disgrace with the old people for certain heinous sins of omission and commission, neglecting to call or persisting in drinking Burton's ale, astonishes everybody into convulsions of laughter by volunteering the most extraordinary comic songs that ever were heard. And thus the evening passes in a strain of rational goodwill and cheerfulness, doing more to awaken the sympathies of every member of the party in behalf of his neighbour and to perpetuate their good feeling during the ensuing year than half of the homilies that have ever been written by half the divines that have ever lived. I never changed my mind about that. Christmas has a wonderful power of healing, love and reconciliation across the family, across the city, across the fields, across the boundless oceans to far-flung lands, across the great globe itself. That is what came into the world when the child we celebrate was born in Bethlehem. I've never talked publicly, ladies and gentlemen, of my faith, and certainly not in the church. I believe that that is a matter between me and my Saviour, to whom I speak directly every night in prayer. I married, as you know, very young and had a large family of children. All of them, from first to last, have had a little version of the New Testament that I wrote for them, read to them long before they could read. It is an inseparable part of their earliest remembrances. It was not written to be published. It was a private thing. I would like, though, if you will indulge me, to read you the opening of that little book, a children's New Testament. My dear children, I am very anxious that you should know something about the history of Jesus Christ. For everybody ought to know about him. No one ever lived who was so good, so kind, so gentle, and so sorry for all people who did wrong or were in any way ill or miserable as he was. And as he is now in heaven, where we hope to go and all meet each other again after we are dead, and there be happy always together, We can never think what a good place heaven is without knowing who he was and what he did. He was born a long, long time ago, nearly 2,000 years, at a place called Bethlehem. His father and mother lived in a city called Nazareth, but they were forced by business to travel to Bethlehem. His father's name was Joseph, and his mother's name was Mary. And the town, being very full of people, also brought there by business, there was no room for Joseph and Mary in the inn or any house. So they went into a stable to lodge, and in this stable, Jesus Christ was born. There was no cradle or anything like that there, so Mary laid her pretty little boy in what is called the manger, which is the place the horses eat out of. And there he fell asleep. And while he was asleep, some shepherds who were watching sheep in the fields saw an angel from God, all light and beautiful, come moving over the grass towards them. At first they were afraid and fell down and hid their faces. But it said, "There is a child born today in the city of Bethlehem near here, who will grow up to be so good that God will love him as his own son. And he will teach men to love one another and not quarrel and hurt one another. And his name will be Jesus Christ. And people will put that name in their prayers because they will know God loves it and will know that they should love it too." And then the angel took the shepherds to go to that stable and look at that little child in the manger, which they did. And they kneeled down by it in its sleep and said, "God bless this child." Now, the great place of that country was Jerusalem, just as London is the great place in England, and at Jerusalem the king lived, whose name was King Herod. Some wise men came one day from a country a long way off in the east and said to the king, "We have seen a star in the sky, which teaches us to know that a child is born in Bethlehem, who will live to be a man whom all the people will love." When King Herod heard this, he was jealous, for he was a wicked man. But he pretended not to be. And he said to the wise men, "Whereabouts is this child?" And the wise men said, "We don't know, but we think the star will show us. For this star has been moving on before us all the way here and is now standing still in the sky." Then Herod asked them to see if the star would show them where the child lived, and ordered them, if they found the child, to come back to him. So they went out, and the star went on over their heads a little way before them until it stopped over the house where the child was. Well, this was very wonderful, but God ordered it to be so. When the star stopped, the wise men went in and saw the child with Mary, his mother. They loved him very much and gave him some presents. Then they went away. But they did not go back to King Herod, for they thought he was jealous, though he had not said so. So they went away by night, back into their own country. And an angel came and told Joseph and Mary to take the child into a country called Egypt, or Herod would kill him. So they escaped too, in the night. The father, the mother, and the child, and arrived there safely. But when the cruel Herod found that the wise men did not come back to him, and that he could not, therefore, find out where this child, Jesus Christ, lived, he called his soldiers and his captains to him, and he told them to go and kill all the children in his dominions that were not more than 2 years old. The wicked men did so. Mothers of the children ran up and down the streets with them in their arms, trying to save them, and hid them in caves and cellars. But it was no use. The soldiers, with their swords, killed all the children they could find. This dreadful murder was called the Massacre of the Innocents, because the little children were so innocent.
Yes.
And chanting. Samuel Pickwick and the members of his eponymous club, as well as Mr. Pickwick's inimitable servant, Sam Weller, or Veller. The pronunciation is all according to the taste and fancy of the speaker, as Sam put it himself, leapt into my brain, fully fledged, in the year 1836, when I was still a very young fellow of just 24 years of age, a year before Queen Victoria came to the throne. I wrote as fast as ever I could, as if I were taking dictation, which is just as well, since it seemed that the entire nation was impatiently awaiting the next weekly instalment. Mr. Pickwick, most genial of men, has a sharp curiosity about every natural phenomenon in the wide world, but nothing more warmed his heart or those of the members of his club that bears his name than the Christmas season. As brisk as bees, if not altogether as light as fairies, did the four Pickwickians assemble on the morning of the 24th day of December, in the year of grace in which these, their faithfully recorded adventures, were undertaken and accomplished. Christmas was close at hand, in all his bluff and hearty honesty. It was the season of hospitality, merriment, and open-heartedness. The old year was preparing, like an ancient philosopher, to call his friends around him, and amidst the sound of feasting and revelry, to pass gently and calmly away. Gay and merry was the time, and right gay and merry were at least four of the numerous hearts that were gladdened by its coming. And numerous indeed are the hearts to which Christmas brings a brief season of happiness and enjoyment. How many families whose members have been dispersed and scattered far and wide in the restless struggles of life are then reunited and meet once again in that happy state of companionship and mutual goodwill which is a source of such pure and unalloyed delight. How many old recollections and how many dormant sympathies does Christmas time awaken? Happy, happy Christmas that can win us back to the delusions of our childish days, that can recall to the old man the pleasures of his youth, that can transport the sailor and the traveller thousands of miles away back to his own fireside and his quiet home. But we're so taken up and occupied with the good qualities of this Saint Christmas that we are keeping Mr. Pickwick and his friends waiting in the cold on the outside of the Muggleton coach. On arriving, they all three repaired to Mr. Wardle's large kitchen, in which the family were by this time assembled according to an annual custom on Christmas Eve, observed by old Wardle's forefathers from time immemorial. From the centre of the ceiling of this kitchen, old Wardle had just suspended with his own hands a huge branch of mistletoe. And this same branch of mistletoe instantaneously gave rise to a scene of general and most delightful struggling and confusion, in the midst of which Mr. Pickwick, with a gallantry that would have done honour to a descendant of Lady Tollymgower herself, took the old lady by the hand, led her beneath the mystic branch, and saluted her in all courtesy and decorum. The old lady submitted to this piece of practical politeness with all the dignity which so befitted so important and serious a solemnity. But the younger ladies screamed and struggled and ran into corners and threatened and remonstrated and did everything but leave the room until some of the less adventurous gentlemen were on the point of desisting, when they all at once found it useless to resist any longer and submitted to being kissed with a good grace. Mr. Winkle kissed the young lady with the black eyes, and Mr. Snodgrass kissed Emily, and Mr. Weller, not being particular about the form of being under the mistletoe, kissed Emma and the other female servants just as he called them. As to the poor relations, they kissed everybody. Mr. Pickwick was standing under the mistletoe, looking with a very pleased countenance on all that was passing around him, when the young lady with the black eyes, after a little whispering with the other young ladies, made a sudden dart forward and, putting her arm around Mr. Pickwick's neck, saluted him affectionately on the left cheek. And before Mr. Pickwick distinctly knew what was the matter, he was surrounded by the whole body and kissed by every one of them. "This," said Mr. Pickwick, looking around him, "this is indeed comfort." "Our invariable custom," replied Mr. Wardle. "Everybody sits down with us at Christmas Eve, as you see them now, servants and all. And here we wait until the clock strikes 12 to usher Christmas in. Trundle, my boy, rake up the fire." Up flew the bright sparks in myriads as the logs were stirred. The deep red blaze sent forth a rich glow that penetrated into the farthest corner of the room and cast its cheerful tint on every face. "Come," said Wardle, "a song, a Christmas song. I'll give you one, in default of a better." Thus saying, the merry old gentleman, in a good, round, sturdy voice, commenced without more ado.
God rest you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay, for Jesus Christ our Saviour was born upon this day, to save us all from Satan's powers, when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. From God our Heavenly Father, the blessed angel came, and unto certain shepherds brought tidings of the same. Oh, that in Bethlehem was born the Son of God by name. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. The shepherds at those tidings rejoiced much in mind, and left their flocks a-feeding in tempest, storm, and wind, and went to Bethlehem straight this blessed babe to find. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. But when to Bethlehem they came, whereas this infant lay, they found him in a manger, where oxen feed on hay. His mother Mary kneeling unto the Lord did pray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. Now to
Astonishing as it may seem, there are those whose hearts are impervious to the spirit of Christmas. One such was my character, Ebenezer Scrooge, who presented himself to me on a sudden one day in the year 1843. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and on his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature about always with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. Merry Christmas! Out upon a Merry Christmas! What's Christmas to you but a time for paying bills without money? The time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. If I had my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. Uncle, nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine. But you don't keep it. Well, let me leave it alone then. Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you. Well, there are many things, Uncle, from which I might have derived good by which I have not profited, Christmas among them. But I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time, when it's come round, as a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women open their closed-up hearts freely and think of people below them as if they were fellow passengers to the grave. Though it's never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, but I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it. Little Bob Cratchit in his cell involuntarily applauded. Let me hear another sound from you, sir, and you'll keep Christmas by losing your job. Well, nephew, you're quite a powerful speaker. I wonder you don't go into Parliament. Well, don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said he would first see Fred in hell. No, he really did. But why, Uncle? I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? We've never had any quarrel to which I've been a party. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle. Good afternoon, and a Happy New Year. Bob Cratchit let Scrooge's nephew out. In doing so, he let 2 other people in, portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, who now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Mr. Marley's been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night. Well, no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner. A few of us are endeavouring, Mr. Scrooge, to raise a fund to buy the poor and the destitute who suffer so terribly at this time of year some meat and drink and some means of warmth. Thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people have to go without the bare necessities of life, to say nothing of ordinary comforts. Are there no prisons? Well, yes, plenty of prisons. And the union workhouses? Are they still in operation? Very busy. Thank God for that. I was afraid from what you said that something had occurred to stop them in their useful work. They scarcely provide Christian cheer of mind or body. What shall I put you down for, Mr. Scrooge? Nothing. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I support the prisons and the workhouses. They cost enough. And those who are badly off must go there. But many can't go there. And many would rather die. But if they'd rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen. There being no point whatever in continuing the conversation, the gentleman withdrew. While all this was going on, the fog and darkness had thickened so that the ancient tower of a church just outside whose gruff old bell had peeped slyly down on Scrooge for many a year, became invisible and struck the hours and quarter hours in the clouds, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head. The cold was intense, piercing, biting, searching cold. You'll want all day off tomorrow, I suppose, Cratchit? If I was to stop you £0.50 for it, you'd think yourself mightily ill-used, I'll be bound. And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work. Well, it is only once a year, sir. A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Be here all the earlier next morning. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. The office was closed in a twinkling, and Bob slid all the way down the ice on Cornhill 20 times in honour of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town, which is quite a way, I can tell you, as hard as he could pelt, to play at blind man's bluff. Somehow or other, Christmas seems to find its way into almost everything I ever do. Even my story about the Cheap Jack, that's a travelling salesman. Dr. Marigold, he was called. A doctor was fetched to my own mother by my own father when it took place on a common. And in consequence of his being a very kind gentleman and accepting no fee but a tea tray, I was named Doctor out of gratitude and compliment to him. There you have me, Dr. Marigold. With a certain unaccountable inevitability, Marigold's remarkable story comes to its conclusion on Christmas Day. Marigold, having told us during the course of his story how he marries and has a child, how his wife takes against the child, how the child dies, the wife drowns herself, Marigold takes to the road again alone, meets a giant from a fairground, who tells him about a deaf and dumb child called Sophie, unwanted by her father, the owner of the fairground. Marigold adopts Sophie, and they go on the road together, communicating in a sign language which Marigold himself invents. And then he sends her to the deaf and dumb school in London, where she meets a young man similarly constituted, and they get married, and then they go to Australia. And then Sophie writes to Marigold to tell him that she's given birth to a daughter, but she isn't sure yet whether the little girl will be deaf and dumb or not. And then the letters stop, and Marigold takes to the road again. Now, I'd let him better take over from me to tell his own story. He was always like that, unstoppable. 5 years, odd months had gone since Sophie went away. I was at a greater height of popularity than ever. I'd had a first-rate autumn of it, and on the 23rd of December, 1864, I found myself at Uxbridge, Middlesex, clean sold out. So I jogged up to London with the old horse, light and easy, to have my Christmas Eve and Christmas Day alone by the fire in the library car. Now, I'm a neat hand at cookery, and I'll tell you what I knocked up for my Christmas Eve dinner in the library car. I knocked up a beef steak pudding for one, with 2 kidneys, a dozen oysters, and a couple of mushrooms thrown in. It's a pudding to put a man in good humour with everything. except for the bottom 2 buttons of his waistcoat. Having relished that pudding and cleared away, I turned the lamp low and sat down by the light of the fire, watching it as it shone upon the backs of Sophie's books. Well, Sophie's books so brought up Sophie's self that I saw her touching face quite plainly before I dropped off dozing by the fire. This may be a reason why Sophie, with her deaf and dumb child in her arms, seemed to stand silent by me all through the nap. Even when I woke with a start, she seemed to vanish as if she'd stood by me in that very place only a single instant before. But I had started at the real sound, and the sound was on the steps of the cart. It was the light, hurried tread of a child coming clambering up. Well, that tread of a child had once been so familiar to me that for half a moment I believed I was going to see a little ghost. But the touch of a real child was laid upon the outer handle of the door, and the handle turned, and the door opened a little way, and a real child peeped in, a bright little comely girl with large dark eyes. Looking full at me, the tiny creature took off her mite of a straw hat, and a quantity of dark curls fell all about her face. And she opened her lips, and she said in a pretty voice, "Grandfather." Oh my God, I cried out. She can speak. In a moment, Sophie was round my neck as well as the child, and her husband was wringing my hand with his face hid, and we all had to shake ourselves together before we could get over it. And when we did begin to get over it, and I saw the pretty child talking, pleased and quick and eager and busy to her mother, in the signs that I had first taught her mother, the happy and yet pitying tears fell rolling down my face. I suppose it was in the Christmas Carol that I put my best and deepest thoughts about Christmas. I wrote the book in a frenzy, in just 6 weeks, while I was still hammering away at Martin Chuzzlewit, writing those terrible and savage scenes at the end, hanging Jonah Chuzzlewit, punishing Pecksniff. But I put every last particle of my heart and soul into my little Christmas story. It was to be a sledgehammer blow against oppression and cruelty in the name of money. I was a man possessed, the merest conduit for my characters. And when I finished the book, I broke out like a madman. Such dinings, such dancings, such conjurings, such blind man's bluffings, such theatre goings, and such kissings out of old years and kissing in of new ones. In the final chapter of the book, Scrooge, having been haunted, tormented even, by the three spirits of Christmas, past, present, and yet to come, is finally restored to himself, filled with a new tenderness for his fellow human beings. He's even discovered that faculty so rare in the excessively rich, a sense of humor. Newly joyous, Scrooge goes to his nephew Fred's on Christmas Day, where he is received with open arms, wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful happiness. Scrooge was early at the office next morning. If he could be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming in late, that was the thing he had set his heart upon. 9 o'clock, no Bob. 1:15, no Bob. Bob Cratchit was fully 18 minutes and a half behind his time. What do you mean by coming in here at this time of day? Oh, I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time. I think you are, sir. It's only once a year, Mr. Scrooge. It shall not be repeated. I was rather making merry yesterday, sir. Step this way, Cratchit. Now, I'll tell you what, my friend. I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, I'm about to raise your salary. Bob trembled. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down, holding him, and calling to the people in the courtyard below for help and a straitjacket. A Merry Christmas, Bob, said Scrooge. A merrier Christmas than I've given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary immediately and endeavor to assist your family in any way I can. And this very afternoon, we will discuss your future over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Make up the fires, Bob. And go out and buy a second coal scuttle. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not laugh at in the onset. His own heart laughed, and that was good enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived in that respect upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed that knowledge. And may it truly be said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.
The BBC Singers' Dickensian Christmas was written and curated by Simon Callow and Jonathan Manners. The conductor was Ben Palmer and the organist was Annie Lydford.